Thank you. Right, I'm going to try and pick up some of the themes that emanated from Jelly and from Mary's marvellous talk, and link them together with the thing that I'm absolutely passionate about. And I suppose really one of the things that we're all interested in is how you take something that is unloved and turn it into something that is confident and loved and wanted and desired. Because the idea of desire in humans is such a compelling thing. And I don't know, hands up who feels desired. Oh, come on. That's not enough of you. But it's very interesting, because it's a tough word, isn't it, desired? Okay, so, well, hands up who feels loved. Okay, not everybody. I'm sorry. All right, but this relationship between going from desire, from love to desire, is where you get this energy, right? Because love can include lots of affection, lots of nostalgia, but it can also include lots of passivity, as those of you who have not put up your hand to say you're desired know that you might be loved, you might love, but desire, that's another thing. And I think that the energy that propels people towards something is because they really want it. And thinking about the theme of death, since we've covered this quite a lot, I mean, and the notion of people sort of saying, it's never over till it's over. I mean, there are two things I think about death. Well, one is that I wanted to do a festival of death a couple of years ago, and I did a festival of death. And people said to me, nobody's wanting to go to a festival of death, believe me, Jude. And I said, believe me, they will want to go to a festival of death, because it's the thing that unites all of us. We are all going to die. But it's actually an incredibly fertile and exciting territory. It just depends how you approach it. So a bit like Jelly, it was like not everybody knew how much they wanted to immerse themselves in death until they were encouraged to think about it in a different way. And our Festival of Death at the Southbank Centre, I had in my mind all of those people who go shopping in BMQ and are building a wardrobe to avoid mortality. And instead of that, I said, well, come to a Festival of Death. You can see incredible Ghanaian coffins, you know, the ones that they make in sort of forms of Nike shoes or astronauts' ships or all these sorts of things that Ghanaians do to celebrate death. We'll talk about everything from making your own wills through Walt Disney, who didn't even believe death was possible, hence freezing himself, cryonics. And it was an amazing, exciting festival. 14,000 people came. And it just demonstrated to me that actually the human desire for curiosity and the satisfaction of exploring the new is never going to go away. That's the nature of creativity, the nature of imagination. But the starting point for me about all of these things is that I love other people's imagination. It's other people's imagination that I think we're trying to engage in when you're thinking about desire. Because often when you talk about creativity, you talk about creative agencies, creative organisations like the Southbank Centre, you think you're talking about your own creativity. But in a sense, you aren't talking about that. You're talking about how much do you believe in the creativity of other people to be excited by them, by ideas, and then propel themselves towards them through desire. So my unloved project all my life has fallen into two camps. One is the unloved public, who many, many people throughout history have never believed had a spark of imagination. And the other thing is the unloved arts organisation, that people say, well, it's worthy, but we don't really want to go to it. Those two things side by side have been the things propelled me through my life. And I don't know anything about any of you, but I do know that if you're going to talk about creativity, like desire, you've got to start with yourself. You know, you've got to believe in your own creativity and be interested in your own creativity and not submerge your own creativity on the grounds that, well, somebody else can be creative and I'll follow up behind. When I was a little girl growing up in Liverpool, Liverpool was sort of the place that the most unlikely thing had happened in. You know, the Beatles had emerged, Jerry the Pacemakers, Mersey. I mean, all of these people had emerged out of a place that, I mean, it wasn't exactly dull, but, you know, it was a port city, it was a very poor city, it had massive diversity, but it didn't have confidence, and suddenly this huge confidence happened to it. And the amount that I know about advertising agencies has increased amazingly in the last couple of years, because my partner is somebody called Andrew Cracknell, who wrote a book called The Real Madmen. He worked for many years in advertising. And reading his book and talking to him, I realised that some of the great revolutions in advertising, that Volkswagen example being one, came from a group of people on Madison Avenue who were not the establishment, who were not the entitled, who were not the empowered, but were actually the Italians and the Jewish and the blacks and the people who were sort of the outsiders. It was their energy trying to get in to the establishment, their desire to be there and to change things that unleashed their masses of creativity. And of course, they knew how to talk to people who also were on the outside. So the revolution in advertising in the 60s, as I understand it, 50s really, I suppose, was new people talking to new people. And that famous statement, I think it might have been Ogilvy, said, never patronise your customer, she could be your wife. That idea of never underestimating other people's creativity is the thing that has always absolutely fueled me. So what I note from Mary and what I note from Sam is idealism, massive idealism. About, we do not have to live like this, and people do not have to put up with not just second best or third best, but nothing. They don't have to. We don't have to, and it's not right. And what I get from you is that jelly matters. But it's more than that. You're actually saying that the palate is an amazing ingredient of human nature, and we should be enticing it. We should make it desire a variety of things, and let's go to any lengths to prove that it can be the case. So I suppose that the thing that, again, we're all linked by is it's not just the sort of stamina of sort of saying, I like a challenge. It's actually to do with, well, what kind of society do we believe in, and what kind of society do we want? We want a society where all kinds of different people can be included doing an amazing range of things, where they can bring out their full potential, whether that be their palate or their body, and that therefore society becomes so much richer and so much more interesting as a result. And when you're thinking about product, which presumably is an awful lot of what you're doing, then the reason that we didn't want to live in the Soviet Union, we thought, was because we didn't believe that one thing was right for everybody, done in this way, packaged in this way, and sold in this way. In other words, we felt that diversity had to appear in all its glorious forms. And that's not just about sort of selling a product, it's about, I suppose, what we believe in about humans. Now, I inherited a place called the Southbank Centre, which was famous for two things. It was famous in 1951 for the Festival of Britain. And then it became famous in the 70s and 80s for being a concrete jungle where mostly was inhabited by homeless people and skateboarders who were still there. But my contention when I came was that if it was loved enough, and if you loved the idea of people enough, you could change it from being really a very moribund place into a place that was absolutely full of both intimacy and huge, large-scale events. Now, you don't need to concentrate on these slides, really. They're just sort of background detail. Because I was told when I came that you really couldn't change this institution. And I, like Mary in the High Street, I thought, no way do I believe that. No way do I believe that you could not change the largest institution in the world, because that's what it is, it's 21 acres, that this couldn't be somewhere that belonged to everybody. And, I start from idealism because it happens to be, the energy for me is about knowing absolutely that the ingredient that makes up a human is powered from the imagination. It isn't something that we notice that any other creature has, the ability to fantasize about what could be possible and then make it happen. It's this sort of incredible ability to conjecture something that isn't there yet and then work out how to do it. And always be inventing and rethinking. Now, all through history, we have been told successively that only some people have imagination, and only some people have the right to it, and only some people would understand even if they got it. So this notion of finer feelings has been a most pernicious aspect of human development. And if you read there's some very interesting books on the masses, but obviously all through history, people have talked about the masses in a very derogatory manner, and implying really that the masses need one thing, well, let's say chicken in the high street, and proper people, finer feelings people, need something far, far more interesting than that. But as democracy has brought certain changes in human rights, i.e., once upon a time, it was not thought possible that everybody could read and write. Now we all know that everybody is capable of reading and writing, we just don't want them all to. Hence Malala being shot by the Taliban. But as these frontiers of human rights get crossed, then you draw attention to, okay, it's one thing to say these rights exist, how are we evidencing these rights? So for me, Article 27 of the Human Rights Declaration is everybody has an imagination and the right to freely experience the arts. And I'm absolutely compelled for that not just to be a kind of they ought to, but for them to desire to, because of what's in them, not because I want to show them something spectacular and impressive, but because I believe, just as everybody can read and write, everybody is capable of being creative, and we have millions of examples of that. And the more that you lift the barrier democratically in terms of education, the more voices emerge, the more extraordinary pieces of creativity happen. And whether it's Mary's fashion young people in Harvey Nichols, or it's people thinking how can they create a 3D jelly, these are voices and ideas that fuel human creativity. And the more you stop thinking of the masses, and the more you think of all these individuals with a story to tell or an idea to have, the more exciting and amazing the planet becomes. So more people for more art is the thing I want to happen. But my version of art is ever widening, because it's really something which helps you to consider what is a human in some sort of form or other, whether it be a book or a novel or a film or a rap piece or whatever. And so I also knew in creating the Southbank Centre that you had to look past this concrete jungle and think, well, why did anybody create this thing in the first place? Why did they create the high street? Why did they create the jelly? I mean, it was something to do with delight, something to do with community, something to do with congregation. It was something to do with the belief in what humans need. It's never just about selling something for straight commerce. I don't believe that. I don't believe most of you are in this room because you just think, well, a quick win is all I want. It's something much more profound than that. And in the Festival of Britain after the Second World War, when arguably the world had seen something that was so horrific, organised extermination, not just Hitler, Stalin too, millions of people destroyed forever, and also a feeling from the young men and women who went to fight the war in Britain that they'd already seen what happened in the First World War. They came back and life was the same. It was the same. And they said, no, we're not going to have that. So after the Second World War, that was when Britain introduced some extraordinary things. That was when the new Education Act came in 1944, Welfare Act came in, National Health came in at that point, as did subsidising the arts, i.e. putting money into the arts so that many, many people could explore what creativity felt like. And the Festival of Britain took one of the most unloved, ghastly sites on the south of the river, which was the mad side. The lunatic asylum was there. It was the criminal side. The Brixton prison was there. All the immigrants were all shoved over there. Nobody went south of the river. Who lives south of the river? Okay. But, 20 years ago, probably very, very few of you, unloved. And in 1951, they decided that they would take this strip of the Thames and turn it into something called the Festival of Britain. And it was... they took a phrase from the war artists, the propaganda of the imagination. And they said, that is what we are going to do. We're going to make it a place of extraordinary delight. They built amazing buildings. A Festival of Britain, the Festival Hall was one, but these incredible pop-ups all over this 27 acres as it was then. The Dome of Discovery. I mean, absolutely amazing in 1951 what they did. Colour. They had science, technology. They did exhibitions on Arctic discovery. They did things about the moon before anybody had gone there. And it really was for everyone. And it was free. And 8 million people, which was a third of the British population, came. And those people who came were from everywhere, and they were all types. And 50% of the artists who made the Festival of Britain were refugees. So in the same way that I suppose Joey Delamina in New York in that period was kind of going, they think I'm an oik, they think I'm an itai, I'm getting in there and I'm going to sell product in a different kind of way. The people who made the Festival of Britain, who were young and often outsiders, were saying, we want to do something that has never been done before on the side of the river that everybody hates, and we are going to make it so amazing that 100 years later, people will still be talking about it. And they will. I mean, 60 years later, all its design, it still affects so much of the iconography of what we think of as Britain, not Little Britain, but Great Britain. So when I went, I said to people, let's reclaim the idea of festival. Festival doesn't just have to mean sort of generalised gaiety. You mentioned Glastonbury. It doesn't just have to be, Wellingtons and boots. And it's not just stars on stages. Festival is something quite profound. It's something meditative. It's something that celebrates the dead, but it's also celebrating the living. And it's got many, many layers. And I felt that if I introduced all sorts of different kinds of delights into this 21 acres, from real food markets through to Indian dancing buskers, through to boating lakes on the roof of the Hayward, and also, say to people, you're allowed, just come. Nobody's asking you to buy anything. Here's a deck chair, sit down. And so in the very first opening that I did when we refurbished the Royal Festival Hall, I asked 18,000 people to come and be the performers. And obviously they weren't all professional. It was saying, I believe that 18,000 non-professional people can provide amazing activity for what then became 250,000 visitors over 2 days. I try to make sure all the time that we're saying to people, the most important thing is that you're here, not that you buy anything. So 50% of the work that we do is now free. And because 50% of the work is free, we've created an economy which has gone up by 2/3 since I came. 25 million people now come across the site. We have nearly 2 million people buying tickets. And this is completely different than 7 years ago. And I mean, again, like Mary, I'm not going to put all of this at my feet, but it does come from a central idea, which is, don't tell me that people won't come if you're giving them something that they love. But the first thing you've got to give is the invitation. You've got to say, I really can't do this without you. And you, in my case, are the public, the masses, the children, all the people who people say, well, they're not very creative, are they? That's absolute rubbish. So I can't remember who said this morning, but people respond to energy, and they respond to the energy of other people, and they say, well, I'm not really like them, but I'd like to be near them. So look at this is the big chair dance. These are all elderly people who can't walk. And we created this dance with an Indian choreographer, because obviously so much of Indian work is with the hands. And so huge numbers of elderly people did this massive choreographic piece, and thousands of people came to watch it. And of course, not only were these elderly people artists, they were loved artists. And it became okay to not be able to walk. I mean, it was an actual asset. You couldn't be in the dance if you could walk. This is Udderbelly. We put this upside-down purple cow down, which we now have every summer. When I first said I was going to do this, people were appalled, and they said to me, this is the Royal Festival Hall in the Southbank Centre. You can't have an upside-down purple cow. And I said, I'm sorry. If I'm following the idealism of the Festival of Britain, this is a place that enjoys fun and the human right to colour. This absolute nonsense that the arts is sort of more mature and more sophisticated if it's grey or black. Who gave us this garbage? I mean, look at Italy. It was the most extraordinary technicolor place. Greece and Rome were only grey because the paint's washed off. It is an illusion to think coolness is an attractive ingredient in a human. It isn't. Enthusiasm is an attractive ingredient. And colour is something that we're entitled to. And obviously, part of Udderbelly was also getting many, many young people And the more young people who've now been using the Southbank Centre, the more the older people who perhaps had thought of it as their club have begun to realise actually they could bring their grandchildren, they could bring their kids. They can actually watch things that they wouldn't know how to find out in their own walk of life, because of course they're not going to go to a club, and they're not really going to be part of the mixture of human activity unless they go somewhere that includes many different kinds of tribes. And that's what I'm excited by, sort of mass welcome to different tribes, and the recognition that these different tribes can affect each other's creativity. So this is an example of something I did, because obviously we have lots of orchestras at the Southbank Centre, but many people don't go to orchestras and don't really know what the protocol is. So this is something called play orchestra, where you sit down on one of these boxes and it plays an oboe. If you sit down on another box and your bum makes contact with it, it'll play a viola. And if you get enough bums on all these seats, it plays the Rite of Spring by Stravinsky. So the essence was you had to go and find people whose bums you could use, talking about knickers, and as many bums as possible in order to make the whole orchestra play. So of course it was great fun, and it was very convivial. But they also were listening to the Rite of Spring, and it made them understand that this was the formation of an orchestra. Of course, it's educational, it's fun. You don't have to tell people that you're being educative. But then we even persuaded Ashkenazi to come and conduct some of these people who were sitting there. And of course, that was a thrill. It was like winning your golden ticket as Charlie. Global poetry system. So we have one of the largest poetry libraries in the world. But, you know, that sounds quite dull, doesn't it, in a way? So we created the GPS, the Global Poetry System, which means that anywhere that anybody spots all over, first of all, the UK and now all over the world, any kind of poetry, they can pin it up and say, I found this, I found... Some of it's Seamus Heaney, but some of it's, look, this hip-hop chip shop, which we thought was, you know, a fine little haiku. Art by offenders. There is nobody who doesn't benefit from trying to find some way of saying, I'll tell you who I am. I'm a bit like this because this is my song. Or I'm a bit like this is my poem. I'm a bit like this is the cartoon I've done. Everybody benefits from being able to say, I've got a way I can tell you about myself other than just documentary words, and it's through a piece of work I've made. Here's a scarf I knitted you. It's all gestures of saying my identity. And of course, some of the people who have the least chance of having identities are people who you'll never see because they're locked away. So every year we do a huge exhibition with the Kersler Trust, Art by Offenders. And this is a group of people who are ex-offenders, ex-women offenders from Holloway. And they worked as curators along with parents whose children had been killed by knife crimes. And between those two sets of curators, they came to a completely different understanding between themselves about how you can find both remorse and also what forgiveness can look like. So I believe that art is one of the great ways that we can do that. I also totally believe in transformation through art. So this is the Venezuelan Youth Orchestra. So in Caracas, one of the most drug-filled and gun-filled places in the world, 30 years ago, a man called Abreu started a little orchestra in a garage with 7 street children. And his contention was, if you believe that every single child is capable of playing music, and you don't ask them what their class background is, and you don't start from whether their parents can afford to give them a lesson, you just say every single child can do this. And you say to a child, right, I've taught you 2 notes, will you teach those 2 notes to the child next to you? That you can start a system of creativity. So now in Venezuela, there are 750,000 children and young people playing orchestral music to a standard that is so unbelievable that 9 of the orchestras were performing this year at the Salzburg Festival. And Gustavo Dudamel, who is now also the chief conductor of the LA Philharmonic, is known as one of the best conductors in the world. And this is because, basically, Abreu believed that every human being has an imagination and a potential. So how does that relate to what you do? Well, it sort of relates to what you believe in, I suppose. I mean, I look all the time when I'm thinking about how to put together what the Southbank Centre is, which is a massive ecology of creativity. You know, I'm looking at how Oaxaca turned what they did from Mexican street art into a sort of fantastic emporium of food. I'm looking at 10 years before that, you know, how Wagamama kind of set out all those great big tables and said, if you walk past with steamy noodles, people are going to get excited. You know, we've now got Look Mum No Hands, a bicycle shop combined with cakes. I love people's passions, and I'm absolutely convinced that when you start with people's passions, people are drawn towards it. They desire other people's desire. That's what it comes down to. When you see somebody who desires you, you can't help but be a bit interested. And this is what, you know, what makes people have adventure. You know, most of my history has been about trying to create a sense of adventure. I'm trying to get the classical music world, you know, to understand that it is not enough to have a great product. As Max Hole, who's head of Universal, will tell you, can't sell the bloody stuff, because we all know that Mozart's absolutely marvellous, and those of us who know it and listen to the music. But how do you get people who, broadly speaking, know that Mozart's marvellous, but don't expect that they're going to have an incredible experience with him, especially since he's dead, talking about death? Well, you have to find a context in which you can discover it in a very different sort of way, which is the sort of idea of jellies. You know, you've got to put together, you know, perhaps Mozart as a jelly mould would be it, but you've got, I mean, everything that you're doing is going, right, here's something that looks, you know, maybe a conventional thing. How do I make it an adventure so that people say I'm buying the adventure, not just the thing? And that is really what so much of what trying to create art is about. It's what's the idea inside is marvellous, but what's the thing that will take me into the idea? So I started a festival called The Rest is Noise, which is I understood that so many people love history, so many people love science, they love politics, they love public opinion, they like to, you know, they like sort of the media and gossip going around about things, but they don't like classical music. But if you say, do you know, the person, let's just take Ligeti. Now, you might not know who Ligeti is, but if you've watched 2001 Space Odyssey, you would have heard the music, because Kubrick used that music for a huge piece of the soundtrack. But the point about Ligeti is that he was brought up in the Second World War. He saw his own family destroyed. And at the end of it, he came back as a composer and said, I will never write a piece of rhythm that is in step again. I never want to write a piece of music where the boot strikes the floor in rhythm. Because he said that was the rhythm that destroyed my family. Now, once you know that piece of information, it's really fascinating to think, right, where does he go then with that feeling? I want to work away from rhythm. All those composers after the Second World War who said, I will never write an anthem again, because anthemic music, Beethoven's Ninth, was used by the Nazis, so I will reinvent music, Boulez. You might not end up liking their music, but you'll certainly be interested in their story, because those stories are what we're talking about, not starting just from the end product as if you're supposed to understand in advance. So I suppose the thing that perhaps we share is, do you believe in other people's creativity? Because if you do, you can stretch them very, very far and give them amazing adventures in your work. Do you believe in your own creativity? And is that because you like being creative, which is fine, or do you have another thing that's compelling you about what you'd like to change in the world? Because when you put the two things together, I want to change the world for the better, let's hope, because after all, Hitler was very creative, but we don't necessarily want that kind of creativity on the loose. We want creativity applied to human progress, and if you're going to do those two things together, you have to apply your imagination. But applying your imagination, believing that everybody else's imagination is where the real excitement lies, that's what I think you learn. And that's what I think produces extraordinary changes in society. And that's what I think we're all about. Thank you.